Welcome, everybody, to Hands-On Apologetics. You have entered into Virtual Most Powerful's Apologetics Dojo, kicking off a brand new broadcast week here in the dojo in which we learn how to explain, defend the faith with clarity, charity, and confidence. And got a great show to kick off the week because we're going to be bringing into the dojo none other than Pat Flynn will be joining us. As you know, Pat is himself a convert from atheism to Catholicism. And, man, he is just a brain when it comes to all things theistic apologetics and even beyond that. Just a great guy. Amazing ministry, not just to, as an outreach to get people involved in, learning philosophy, but he also does all sorts of things remarkably well, including this idea of generalism, which he espouses. So we're going to have Pat on, and we're going to go deep and talk about the objection against the existence of God, namely the problem of evil. You know, it's interesting. Thomas Aquinas, in his Summa Theologica, when he proposes the question of whether God exists, he only gives two objections. And both of them are objections that you still have today. And so he really does put his finger on probably the best objections to the existence of God. One is essentially that given modern science, we don't really need God to explain anything. That's certainly a view out there. But the second one is the problem of evil. So Pat has done a lot of thinking and a lot of writing in regards to the problem of evil. So he's going to be coming on. He's going to be sharing his own insights and approaches to addressing the problem of evil. So many of you, maybe you're talking to a non-believer, maybe you're being challenged by someone who's an atheist, and they're using the problem of evil, you definitely need to listen to that portion of the program, which, by the way, begins on the other side of the break. On this side of the break, we're going to do our Finding the Fallacy, where we look at an informal fallacy. Today's informal fallacy is the equivocation fallacy. And we also are going to meet an early church father. Today's early church father is a biggie, especially for you apologists out there. If you don't know this particular early church father, you need to. And that is Saint Ignatius of Antioch. One of my all-time favorite early church fathers, to tell you the truth. Just a remarkable man, remarkable writings, remarkable insights, and remarkable evidence for the antiquity of our faith. All of that's coming up today. So before we begin, I want to welcome all of you to the show. Welcome aboard, all of you listening on radio around the country. And of course, all of you live stream peeps. I don't want to forget you. And also the podcast peeps out there listening to this show around the world and in the future. It's great to have you on board, folks. And hope all is going well with you. By the way, if you want to access this show, way to do so, of course, is through the flagship website, Virgin Most Powerful Radio, which is virginmostpowerfulradio.org. That is the website, folks. Click on it. Actually, that should probably be your homepage because, man, there's just so much information, a lot of material there. First, you'll find out about upcoming events. There's going to be I wish I could go to the men's conference coming up with Jesse and Johnny Romero. Man, that's going to be a barn burner. I just wish I could do it, but I can't. But many of you probably will. So check it out. Go on the website and get info for that. Just scroll down to Hands-On Apologetics, and boom, you'll get all the episodes that we have there. This episode will be uploaded as quickly as possible. And so if you can't listen to all of Pat Flynn's segment, or maybe, I mean, the guy has a dizzying intellect. Sometimes he goes through things, pretty complex ideas pretty quickly. So you might want to re-listen to it. This is the place to go, virtualmostpowerfulradio.org. Click on Hands-On Apologetics. Then you can listen to it at your own convenience. You could download it. You could share it with friends. And I have a feeling that this is going to be a really powerful tool for those who are engaging in discussions about whether God exists, what kind of attributes he has, and so on. Also, give you the official dojo email, which is I'm subject the website, which is questions@handsonapologetics.com. That's it, folks. questions@handsonapologetics.com. That comes directly to me, and I do answer your emails. I'm trying to think anything else that I need to do before we do our usual exercises. I think I pretty much covered everything. So why don't we go to our Finding the Fallacy segment, which is the equivocation fallacy today. Equivocation fallacy in logic. Equivocation is an informal fallacy resulting from the use of a particular word or expression in multiple senses within an argument. It's a type of ambiguity that stems from a phrase having two or more distinct meanings, not from the grammar or the structure of the sentence. Okay, so this is very, very important. Whenever somebody's making an argument and there's a term that's being used throughout the argument, you need to be careful to make sure that that term keeps its original meaning throughout, okay? Because words, ideas, terminology, many times the same word could have multiple meanings, right? Like bank. Bank is a classic, okay? A bank can mean a financial institution. A bank can also be the side of a river, right? Like a river bank. But they're very, very different meanings, but it's the same word, right? So if you're using bank in an argument, you have to make sure that either you're talking about financial institutions throughout, or you're talking about the side of a river throughout, but you can't switch the meaning in the middle of the argument. Because if you do, you commit today's fallacy, which is the equivocation fallacy. Pretty straightforward. By the way, this could be very, very subtle. In fact, in my own work on the Old Testament canon stuff, I think I've noted in previous times we talked about equivocation, the word prophecy has many different meanings. And I uncovered equivocation fallacy using the word prophecy, but man, that was very subtle. And it only came to light when I realized you could use prophets or prophecy in more than just one sense. So yeah, this is one of those equivocations. They're used all the time. In fact, that's the basis of a lot of humor, but it can be very subtle. So you have to be, razor sharp when you're looking at people's arguments and thinking critically about them. Okay, let's move on. Let's meet our early church father for today. Like I said, he's a biggie. St. Ignatius of Antioch. St. Ignatius is the third bishop of Antioch, succeeding St. Evodius, who was the immediate successor of St. Peter. So a very, very early church father. He is accounted as an apostolic father by reason of him being a hearer of the apostle John. During the reign of the Emperor Trajan, which is 98 through 117 AD, and probably about the year 110 AD, he was sentenced to the beast in the arena. On his journey from Antioch to Rome and certain martyrdom, he wrote 7 letters, the only extant writings we have of him. Almost everything of the little that is known of him is gleaned from the letters. It's addressed to Christian communities in Ephesus, Magnesia, Trellis, Rome, Philadelphia, and Smyrna. And one to a personal friend of his, another apostolic father, Bishop Polycarp of Smyrna. The most important of these letters is to the Romans, yet all 7 are veritable treasure houses for the history of dogma. And yes, Jurgen's Faith of the Early Fathers hits the nail on the head in that regard. It is a treasure trove of apologetic ammo, if you will, just because, he touches on all sorts of doctrine throughout those 7 letters. The letters of Ignatius of Antioch come to us. Oh, by the way, I should probably mention this. For example, things he touches on is the hierarchical nature of the church, the monarchical church. In fact, it's very, very Catholic, and the authenticity of these letters, their genuineness, has been vindicated by some really big names in religious history, like Lightfoot, Harnack, Zahn. they're almost all universally accepted now as genuine. They come to us in 3 recensions. This is something important for you apologists to realize because it can get confusing. Some translations actually have all 3 recensions. There's a long, a short, and a Syriac abridgment. And the first one to come out was the long version. This is a interpolated text that was made sometime in the 4th century. The authentic recension is called the short recension. That's extant only in Greek, which was probably the original language the letters were written in. And then you have the Syriac abridgment, which apparently was made from a no longer extant Syriac translation of the short recension. So if you are ever encountered the 3 recensions, go with the short one. There's many other letters that purport to come from Ignatius, but they are all spurious. And man, we could probably take an entire show going through all the fantastic quotations from Ignatius of Antioch, but I'd rather leave that up to you. So just go to a website that has the early church fathers, like newadvent.org, and read them for yourselves. There's only 7 letters, and I tell you, it would be incredibly beneficial to do so. All right, coming up next, we're going to be chatting with Pat Flynn. We're going to talk about the problem of evil. Stay tuned. And welcome back, everybody. Hands on Apologetics. Well, we're going to dive into probably the ultimate objection against the existence of God, which is the problem of evil. And there's no person, I think, that tackles the problem of evil as thoroughly and inventively as our guest, who is Pat Flynn. Pat Flynn is the host of Pat Flynn Show, which covers everything from fitness, mental health, business, philosophy. But he also has a fantastic YouTube channel that is becoming more and more popular, which is awesome. It's called Philosophy for the People. And Pat Flynn dives deep into philosophy classics and all sorts of different apologetic stuff. And by the way, you can check out all his great stuff at chroniclesofstrength.com. And Pat, welcome back to Hands on Apologetics.
Gary, it's always a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yes, I see you still have the beard.
It has reached full sentience at this point, Gary, so It would be unethical for me to cut it.
Well, it's important to have a good philosopher beard when you're dealing with philosophy.
Yes, of course, yeah.
Does it affect your weightlifting at all?
No, and I should say that this beard is actually largely the result of my dear wife Christine's encouragement. She wasn't the most enthusiastic about the long hair I used to have. She was, sometimes she liked it, sometimes she was annoyed by it, especially how much I shed. But she seems to be quite fond of the beard. So as long as it has the wife's endorsement, we're going to keep going with it.
There you go. Good. You also, there's many great guitar players that are bearded as well. So, you join that pantheon of bearded guitar players as well.
Right. Yeah. I'm always looking at, the great philosophers and guitar players, and there seems to be something common to all of them. Right. And I thought, well, what am I missing? Oh,
that's right. The beard. Yeah.
Must be the beard. Right. There we go. So we'll get there soon enough. Right. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So, like I said in the intro, you've done some really great work in the problem of evil. So when you suggested, hey, why don't we revisit the problem of evil? It's like, yeah, this is great because you always come up with different angles that you normally don't see. At least I don't find it in the realm of apologetics at all. Maybe it's in the literature.
Yeah.
But you come up with some really cool angles on tackling the problem of evil.
Well, thanks. It's something I think a lot about because it's a very important objection, as you said at the beginning of the program. It's probably the objection, right? It's one of 2 objections that Aquinas considers. The other objection being that you just don't need God to explain things, and I believe that was the topic of our previous conversation. Mm-hmm. But certainly on the more popular level, it seems to me that if somebody is going to be skeptical of the existence of God or skeptical of Christianity, and you ask them, why don't you think God exists? Yeah, if they don't give you the because science objection, it's almost certainly going to be because of the evil and suffering in the world. So it's not just a common objection, it's an ancient objection. It goes right back to ancient times. The problem of evil has sort of always been a challenge to theism. especially classical theism. But it's a challenge that I think with careful thought can not only be overcome, but I think we can do a little bit of philosophical judo and even begin to reverse the problem of evil. However ironic that they may seem, the longer I've thought about this, Gary, and the deeper you get into the theoretical details, I really actually think that the sort of suffering of our experience is evidence against naturalism, not against theism. So I'm sure we'll head in that direction at some point. It's a bold claim, but I think it's actually true. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think so too, just from some of the stuff that we talked about in the past. Now, before we begin, in your former life as an atheist, did the problem of evil play an important role?
Yes and no. I was more on the side of I just don't think you need God as an explanation or science is enough. I guess it was always sort of in the background for me, but it was not. If you would have asked me back then, why don't you believe in God? I don't think I would have necessarily brought out the problem of evil. I most likely would have brought out some, half-baked objection concerning how, science has got this. God isn't doing anything for us in the explanatory realm. So it's not, honestly, Gary, the problem of evil became more pressing for me once I began to seriously consider Christianity. It was sort of a barrier that was raised as I was already kind of considering more seriously theism. So it was something I began to consider more like as I was sort of already on the way. For me, I really honestly do not think it was something that originally was a motivation for my naturalism, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. So, okay. Well, where do you want to start?
Yeah, maybe we just start with some mapping some of the terrain, the ways that the problem of evil has been responded to, and then we can get into some of my preferred responses. Because I think it's helpful to have a range of options, just to see that there's a lot of ways that a theist or a Christian can respond to this, right? Mm-hmm. So just in a very basic sense, there's an easy solution to the problem of evil, and this is just called the well, God exists solution, right? And the well, God exists solution sort of goes like this. Well, I know God exists because I have Aquinas' De Ente argument or some other metaphysical demonstration, and I can, use reason to see that God is just the necessary condition for the very existence of the world, and the logical connections between things like contingency and necessity are just a lot stronger and more clear to me than any inconsistency or tension between the suffering and evil that we experience and God as a supreme being, right? So I'm just going to privilege what is clear, which is, contingency type arguments or other metaphysical arguments for the existence of God over what is unclear. And so God exists, and there's lots of evil and suffering in the world. And since both of these things are there, both of them are actual in a sense, they must be compatible. And that's the end of it, right? Now, obviously, that is not going to be a deeply satisfying response emotionally or spiritually, but I think that is a perfectly legitimate response if you really do think that there are good arguments for the existence of God. Brian Davis actually kind of offers this type of response in some of his work. He just thinks, hey, look, there's really good philosophical arguments to believe in the existence of God. And there's no obvious strict incompatibility, any, strict contradiction between God and the suffering and evil of our experience. So privilege what is clear over what is unclear. And maybe we don't have any good story of why God allows all the suffering and evil. But they're both here. So this is just sort of the end of it. And I offer that as just a first consideration, because I actually do think there are good arguments for the existence of God. And I think if it ultimately came down to it, and this is sometimes something I try to impress upon confirmation students, is that, when it comes to faith and when it comes to philosophical positions, there's always going to be questions and difficulties that you're not going to have an immediate solution to. But it's important that you don't get sort of overly emotional and allow those questions and difficulties to explode into serious doubts if you already have really good reasons for believing something is true, right? Questions by themselves are not necessarily objections, and difficulties do not need to become serious doubts. And you just sort of see this in the life of many people, just because they don't see what the solution to something is, to some question or even some puzzle. For whatever reason, they seem to want to allow that to cast doubt on things that they are clear about or seem to be clear about before. So maybe this is just a point about, trying to keep thinking in straight channels and to keep privileging what is clear over what is unclear. So that would be the first thing I want to say, Gary. I don't know if you have any return thoughts on that one.
No, that's it's a sound approach. Although, like you said, is probably not very persuasive, especially if somebody doesn't believe there's good proofs for the existence of God. But what you say, I think, logically follows, since there is no true contradiction between the existence of God and the presence of evil.
Yeah, and that's gonna. So for people who it's really the problems of evil. It's not just the problem, because there's been various different formulations. So the most classic is what's called the logical problem of evil. And this is an argument that tries to tease out some contradiction between God and the suffering or evil of our experience. And most philosophers, not just theists, obviously, but even atheist skeptics, have really kind of walked away from the logical problem of evil. Why? Because they haven't been able to support a crucial premise. And that crucial step in the logical problem of evil was something like God cannot have morally justified reasons for permitting the evil and suffering of our experience, right? And it's just kind of, been shown that no matter how hard the skeptic tries, there's just no way that they're in a good position to show that claim is true, right? So I really don't think anybody should be bothered by the logical problem of evil, because most skeptics have abandoned it. What's taken its place is the evidential problem of evil. And what the evidential problem of evil tries to argue in a nutshell is that, okay, well, maybe evil doesn't or suffering. And for the sake of our conversation, I'm just going to use the term evil in a very broad sense from here on out, because traditionally evil just meant any bad state of affairs. It didn't just mean the sort of moral evil that people do. It also meant anything like a lion eating a gazelle. That's an evil state for the gazelle, because the gazelle is being corrupted, right? So just for the sake of clarity, that's how I'll just use evil for now on to cover all that. So the evidential problem evil wants to say something like this. Well, look, the evil of our experience is just the sort of thing we would expect if fundamental reality is totally indifferent, right? If there's nothing at the basement of reality that cares, that aims, that intends for good outcomes or bad. It's just indifferent, right? It's some physical, natural reality, but it has no intentions, good intentions or bad. That's what naturalism is, right? Naturalism is run by a principle of indifference. So what the evidential problem of evil says is if you're working from a naturalistic perspective, it better predicts a world that's sort of suffused with suffering, like ours, right? But if God exists and, the foundation of reality does have intentions, and it's actually a perfect being, well, then the suffering and evil of our experience just doesn't seem like the sort of thing we would expect, right? If there's a sort of perfect foundation, wouldn't we expect everything above it to be perfect? And so what they will claim then is that this is evidence, since we have one theory that predicts the sort of data that we see, that data then being suffering and evil, is confirmation of that theory over the other theory, right? It's better expected if naturalism is true. So that to that extent, evil is evidence for naturalism over theism. Now, the question, of course, aside from whether that's actually a good argument, we'll address that in a minute, is if you think it is a good argument, how much evidence? How much evidence? And this is another point where even skeptics disagree. Some skeptics think it's enormous evidence. It's decisive evidence. Other skeptics think it's a bit of evidence, maybe not overwhelming, right? So this is where another potential response comes into the problem of evil. Not my preferred one, but I think it's worth putting out there. And the theist can just play the total evidence game. The theist at this point could actually say, you know what? I'll give you that. I'll give you that if naturalism is true, you guys have a better prediction of suffering and evil than theism. But here's the deal. There's a lot of other data we have to account for. We have to account for contingency. We have to account for fine-tuning. We have to account for consciousness. We have to account for an objective moral landscape. We have to account for religious experience. We have to account for rationality. And all that stuff is evidence for theism. So when we actually weigh it all out, even if I give you evil, it doesn't matter. Theism still wins evidentially. Yeah. All that's total evidence.
Very good. We're chatting with Pat Flynn. We'll be right back right after this. And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Pat Flynn, talking about the problem of evil. And right before the break, Pat, that you're given the evidential view of the problem of evil, namely that if the naturalist worldview would best explain the presence of evil versus the theistic view. And then you offered an option that not necessarily one that you would take, but that the evidence for God outweighs even the presence of evil, and therefore the scale kind of tips still in theistic favor.
Yeah, that's right. And it's not that I think that there's anything wrong with that response. I just don't think it goes nearly far enough. But it might help at this point if people keep the image of scale in their mind. So at this point, we've just said one potential response. It's okay. Let the naturalists kind of have an evidential weight on their side. How much you think comes from the problem of evil. But you know what? The theist has a lot on their side, and way more. So it still tips in favor of theism at the end of the day. If you think of the scales as competing worldviews, right? And you have these different broad features of the world that need to be explained. And if you think one worldview explains some feature of the world better than the other, like contingency or consciousness or suffering, they get it as a sort of evidential weight in the scale. And it might be a pebble, it might be a boulder. And what I'm saying is with the total evidence approach is even if you give a really hefty weight to the naturalist for evil, it's going to be overwhelmed by all the other considerations in favor of theism. And so, the theist could plausibly just concede that it is a problem for theism, but it's not a decisive problem, and there's still many other better reasons to be a theist than a naturalist at the end of the day. Now, like I said, I don't think that goes far enough. So the next move, the theist, and we're going to get increasingly more aggressive and hopefully more interesting as we go here, Gary, but the next move the theist can do is start to try and take away some of that weight and they can from the naturalist on the problem of evil. And the way they do this is they can start to say something like this: well, not so fast, Mr. Naturalist. Because once we better understand the classical theistic picture, we can tell a story, right, that actually makes the suffering, the evil of our experience not so surprising at all. In fact, it might be just as likely, if God exists, that we would experience a world like this with all the suffering and evil, as it is on naturalism. So maybe we're just trying to stalemate it at this point, right? Just trying to stalemate it. And this is where you often get what's called a defense or a theodicy. There's sometimes distinctions drawn between the two. A theodicy, the way I like to differentiate these two is this, Gary. A theodicy is some story we think is actually true, that is reasonable and consistent from the worldview we actually hold, right? That's what a theodicy is. And it's supposed to be a story that explains why God allows the suffering and evil that we experience, right? Where a defense is just a story that is reasonable and consistent in any worldview, whether we hold it or not. So sometimes philosophers will offer a defense and they'll say, here's a story that might be true for all we know. But since you can't show that it's false, skeptic, that's enough to undermine any confidence that the evil of our experience is unlikely if God exists. Whereas a theodicy is actually a little bit of a stronger claim, because you're not just saying that this story is true for all we know. If you're offering a theodicy, you're saying, I think this story is actually true, and here's why. So while defense is enough, I prefer a theodicy. I guess I always err on the more aggressive and bold side, but it also just strikes me as true. So what we can do is we can start to try and unpack, well, what would follow if God exists and God creates? And would I really expect a perfect world? Does a perfect world even make sense? What should I expect to come or flow from the classical theistic hypothesis? And this takes a lot of work, as you might expect. But essentially, I think the basic theodicies are correct here. That once we take into considerations of human freedom, of God needing to avoid a massively chaotic world, of what just sort of comes along inevitably from creating a material natural world, we're going to start to see that suffering and evil of our experience is not surprising at all. But let me try and unpack at least some of this briefly, and then Gary, if we want to dive into any aspect deeper, we can. I think some of this will be usual rehearsal, but it'll be helpful before we take the next step to show that what the naturalist accuses the theist of, they are actually guilty of, which is that suffering and evil would not be expected if naturalism is true. But let me try and show that it's not, at least not totally surprising if theism is true. So as you know, Gary, in the great tradition of classical theism, and this is certainly true within Christianity, but you find this thought even among the pagans, We think that God is the supreme good. He's identical to the good itself, right? And that the good is sort of naturally self-diffusive. It just sort of naturally seeks to communicate itself. So there's always this great sense that God would seek to share his goodness, and he would seek to share his goodness by bringing other things into creation. And since God is supremely good, we might think that if there's all sorts of great acts that God could do, if one act is obviously greater than another, he's probably almost certainly going to do the greater act. Now, there might just be a bunch of equally good acts, and God just has to sort of arbitrarily decide between them. But it's not unreasonable to think that if something is obviously greater in terms of an action, that if God is going to create or bring forth something beyond himself, he's going to do the better thing, right? So it's cool. It's good that God brings things into existence. Existence is a good thing to have. Almost all of us would agree with that. But an even better thing that God could do is bring things into union with himself, into friendships, love, and relationship with himself. But there's a constraint, right? God can't make a rock love him. Rocks are not capable of love. Only spiritual beings are capable of love, of self-consciously either choosing to love or not God. So if God is going to sort of bring creation into union with himself, and this is a really cool thought that you find among many thinkers, but especially Father Norris Clark, who was a big inspiration to me, he thinks that if God is going to bring all of creation into union with himself, which is like the best thing God could do, then God's going to have to create beings like us, human beings, not just angels, but human beings. Why? Because we have always been seen as a sort of microcosm within the macrocosm. We have material elements, right? We've sort of been formed from the explosion of stars, but we have the immaterial spiritual element. We're like a sort of a concentration point of all of creation, right? And the thought has always been that if God pulls us into union with himself, into this loving shared presence, he pulls all of creation along for the ride. I think that's a really cool story. I think that's actually really, really beautiful. Yeah. So I'm starting to show like this is something that is expected from a classical theistic worldview. God as the supreme good would diffuse his goodness, because there's actually two ways to enjoy one's goodness. This is an important point too. You can just enjoy it, just rest in it, or you can share it. And so it's always been seen that God's act of creation is an act of gratuity. It's God sharing his goodness, and that he would ultimately seek to unite creation with himself, because this is the very best thing. But to do that, he needs to sort of create a microcosm within the macrocosm, beings like us. Okay, so that's one step. The next step is this. Only God's will is naturally impeccable or infallible or perfect. Why? Because only God is identical to the good itself. Any other being that God creates, angel, man, that has intellect or free will, is something that's ordered to an end that is beyond itself. It is not its own rule of operation. Right? It must always look beyond itself to the standard or the moral rule when making judgments and trying to reach its ultimate term, its end, which is union with the divine. And that means it could fail. It means that its liberty is a fallible liberty. Maritain, building on Aquinas, is great on this. He says that God could no more create an impeccable free creature than he could a round square. It's just not metaphysically possible. So if God is going to pursue love, it's going to require free beings, and it's just a necessary risk that those beings could turn from God, that they could sin. And this is just due to the great metaphysical chasm or gap between God and creature. Okay, so that's the next step, that God pursues love and union with creation, that demands beings like us, but it's just inherent that beings like us, in virtue of our finitude and being ordered to something beyond ourselves as our ultimate end, that we could fail. Okay, and Christianity holds that we did fail, but you don't need Christianity for that. Just look around, look around, right? Right. There's something screwy going on here, right, with us. All right, but here's the next step, right? That God's supreme goodness, right, is not going to allow him to be ultimately frustrated, right? That he's going to provide the conditions that are the best or only available means to get us to return to himself, right? Now, there are other constraints in place, right? And one of the constraints of free will is that God can just not determine our free choice, right? God cannot unilaterally over our will if we are resisting God, if we are pursuant in sin. If we are not detesting sin, God cannot just override us, because then only one will is operative, God's, not two. And you need the union of two free wills to actually have love. Eleanor Stump is really, really good on this point. And I would say that almost certainly you need a pretty robust notion of libertarian freedom if you're going to offer a lot of the solutions to the problem of evil that I'm thinking about. But that's okay, because I think that's actually Aquinas' position, and it's totally compatible with classical theism. So what can God do? Well, God can provide the conditions or an arena that are the best or only available means to get us to a point of acquiescence, right? A point where we omit an evil orientation of will, where we effectively surrender to God, right? Where we're no longer actively resisting God, where God can then infuse operative grace in us, justify us, and set us on the path to holiness and union with him. Now, here's a really cool aspect of Aquinas. I know we're kind of getting into weeds here, but I know you told the audience they can just re-listen to this, and I'm just gonna bank on that, right?
There you go.
Here's a really cool aspects of Aquinas' theory of the will. I'm just going to quickly detail that I think ties a lot of this together. Aquinas thinks that our will actually has three gears, right? We can will against something, we can will for something, or we can just omit an act of a will altogether, right? Now, there's kind of two Christian commitments that seem to be in tension concerning salvation. And one commitment is that it seems salvation depends on something that we kind of freely do. Yet the other commitment is that we can't really do anything good apart from God, especially merit salvation. So how does Aquinas solve this issue? Well, he solves it in a really, I think, cool and brilliant way. Because what Aquinas believes...
Pat, I hear the music coming up. That would be a great cliffhanger to come back on the break. So why don't we park it right there? We're chatting with Pat Flynn, talking about the problem of evil, and you'll hear the answer to that conundrum on the other side of the break. Listen to Hands On Apologetics. Stay tuned. And welcome back, everybody. We're chatting with Pat Flynn of Philosophy for the People on YouTube. Check it out if you haven't gone there. Definitely sub and hit the thumbs up. Let's get him more exposure. It's an awesome channel. Pat, man, you came up to a really interesting theological conundrum right there at the last seconds of the last segment. So why don't you set that up again for us?
Yeah, there's so many details and complications. I'm going to try and just give the quick summary story so we can move on to the attack on naturalism. But yeah, Christians have held, and I think rightly, that there seems to be two things that we are committed to concerning salvation. And that is that our salvation depends in some sense on what we freely do, yet we cannot possibly earn salvation by ourselves. So we can't do this good act apart from God, right? Aquinas' solution, in short, is this, that our will has three gears. We can will against, we can will for, or we can omit an act of will at all. And what Aquinas is going to say is that the sort of suffering of our experience can actually get us to acquiesce, that it can get us to at least give up an evil orientation of the will. Now, that's not itself a good act, because it's not an act at all. It's a non-acting, right? Now, it's better than doing evil or willing evil. So something can be better than something else, but not yet a good act. But Aquinas also believes that once there's that sort of, in technical terms, that privation of form, if you will, or orientation of the will, God can then non-coercively infuse grace. This would be operative grace or justification, right? Without doing violence to our will once we're in that point of acquiescence. So here, a simple analogy that I'll borrow from Eleanor Stump, who does a really good job defending and explaining this view of the will, can help illustrate the point. So just imagine somebody, it's actually kind of like me, right, who's like severely phobic of needles, right? And you for whatever reason, you need to get a shot. Like, this is really important. But you're so afraid of needles that even in a doctor's office, you cannot will that the doctor give you a shot. Like, you just can't do it. However, you might be able to a point where you're not willing against it, where you're acquiescent or quelled, and then the doctor gives you the shot. And then you ask the doctor afterwards, or somebody does, hey, did Pat ask for the shot? The doctor would laugh and be like, no, not hardly, right? He's terrified of needles. However, if you also ask the doctor, well, did you force it on him? The doctor would say, no. And we think that that's actually correct. And Aquinas thinks that that's sort of what's going on with justification, right? That we are ultimately in control of our salvation because we can either be resistant or omit an act of resistance, but that's not yet a good act. The good act comes from God, who through concurrent grace causes that higher order desire of wanting to will what God will. So that's a very, brief summary of a very complicated position, but I think that that is not only correct, but it provides a really important reason of why God allows so much suffering. And that is this, that the suffering of our experience might be, in fact, almost certainly is, the best or only available means for God to get us to that point of acquiescence, of surrender, where God can then work with us in a non-coercive way to avoid the worst possible fate that we could actually have, which of course is eternal separation from God. And from the Christian perspective, the reason God allows, this is really important for the problem of evil. The reason God allows suffering and evil is not so we can have good things, right? It's so that we can avoid a really bad thing. We have a sort of spiritual cancer that, if left untreated or unchecked, would result in us hitting the absolute lower bound of the human condition, which is hell, eternally willed separation from God. This is an important point because when it comes to our moral intuitions, we don't usually think it's okay to do something or allow something that's kind of bad to get good things, right? So if I try to push my kid across the street so he can get first in line for a job interview, which might be good for him, and risked him getting hit by a bus, people would think that's not justified. However, if I push my kid off the street, even if it risked him breaking his arm so that he didn't get hit by a bus, we would think that that is justified. And this asymmetry is important because we don't think that God allows bad things just so people can get good things, right? Like be brave or stuff like that. We think God allows bad things to avoid something even worse, which is hell. It's a treatment of a spiritual cancer, a necessary, the best or only available means of treating a spiritual cancer, right? That is a critical point that I think Christianity offers, especially Catholicism, in a really robust way that you don't find in a lot of other theodicies, right? Okay, So now there's one other issue before we turn to trying to hit back at naturalism, and that is instances of suffering that don't seem like that might seem gratuitous. This is the term atheists use. It just seems like a gratuitous evil. Like this is a suffering that God could have prevented with no greater good being lost or something worse happening or whatever. So what should the Christians say about that? And here I want to offer one quick response that thinkers like John Haldane and von Inwagen have offered. And that is that we have to realize that God's working with an entire community, a universe. So God has a general policy that he needs to put in. He needs to set in general conditions that are the best or only available means to facilitate that overall purpose, which is, bringing the most number of people freely to a point of acquiescence and justification as possible, right? But when it comes to general policies, right, God might be able to intervene in, any number of instances, right, especially instances of suffering without subverting the general policy. But he certainly couldn't intervene in all of them without subverting the general policy. So here's the key. God's going to have to draw the line somewhere. And wherever God draws the line, it's probably arbitrary. And I know people probably haven't thought about this with God, but some analogies to drive the point can be helpful. So here's one from von Inwagen about how sometimes we're just stuck with arbitrariness, but arbitrariness can provide a reason for why there's a general reason that God allows something without a specific reason. So let me draw this out real quick. So imagine that you're in the ancient city of Atlantis and it's sinking, and you're in charge of a boat to bring people to safety. And that boat can hold 1,000 people, right? However, if you put 1,000 people in that boat, you're actually 100% certain it's going to sink and everyone's going to die, right? If you just take yourself, you're certain that it's going to make it, right? And then there's everything in between, right? In terms of whether you're going to make it or whether you're not. So there's some things we know are not allowed. It would not be permissible to take everybody, knowing everyone would die. It would not be permissible just to take yourself, right? It would not be permissible to just leave a handful, to just take a handful, right? But at some point, you're going to have to draw the line where you're going to have to say, okay, that's it. We're not taking any more people on the boat. But the thing is you probably, at that point, you probably could have let one more person on, right? And it would not have made a significant difference. Or you could have took one less person and it would not have made a significant difference. But the point is, when you have issues like this concerning arbitrariness, you're justified in drawing a line. somewhere, right? And it has to be drawn somewhere. And so the same thing can be said about God. For his general policy, who knows how much suffering exactly is needed for him to facilitate his purpose, right? But God has to draw the line somewhere, and wherever he draws the line is probably arbitrary. Now, that's not to say that that's the end of the story, because we believe as Christians that if somebody kind of falls on the side of an arbitrary instance of suffering, God's going to make that right in the afterlife. But it does give a reason of why there might be some instances why there's no specific reason for that instance of suffering. And it has to do with the general reason concerning the conditions that God sees as maximally conducive for a wider community for his purpose of salvation, if that makes sense. That's a technical point, but I think it's an important one that sort of completes the theistic story at the end of the day, which allows us to say, hey, actually, the range of suffering and evil that we experience is just what we would expect if God exists and if the Christian story is true. So at worst, it doesn't seem like naturalism explains us any better than theism. Gary, I unloaded a lot right there, and I still have more to go, but why don't I pause for a minute and just gather some of your thoughts or comments?
Yeah, and we're coming up to the end of the program. I don't know if we're going to be able to do justice to the rest of your arguments. Maybe we could have you come on again, and we'll do like a part 2. How's that sound?
I think that's great. You want me to just give a brief teaser of what I think the final move would be? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the final move is to say, okay, not only does theism explain evil as well as naturalism, it explains it far better, because naturalism actually doesn't explain suffering and evil at all. From the naturalistic worldview, it's totally indifferent to the distribution of suffering. And once you peer under the hood of naturalism, the way naturalism tries to make sense of various features of the world, including mental phenomena, makes it so that the suffering of our experience is actually hugely surprising. And this is where we will need another episode, because we'll have to get a little bit into philosophy of mind. But for the naturalist, the important thing to keep in mind is that what's kind of running the show are just physical events or physical interactions. Whatever else mental events or mental phenomena are, there's sort of a residue that floats atop whatever the underlying physical causes are. So they have no downward physical effect, right? So our experience, our felt experience of suffering, our felt experiences of pleasure, they have nothing to do with, the way my joints go, believe it or not, right? If naturalism is true. Now, that seems ridiculous, and it seems ridiculous because it's just self-evidently false that my mental experiences do affect where my joints go. But this is a consequence of the naturalistic worldview, which I'll have to explain in more detail next time. But once you see that, you'll realize that naturalism is compatible with there being no suffering at all, far worse suffering, far less suffering, and it actually makes no specific predictions or anticipations about the distribution of suffering that we would experience. And in fact, once you really unpack it, which we'll do next time, we would expect a world quite unlike ours, where I don't think there would be really any suffering at all, because it's functionally unnecessary or redundant on a naturalistic worldview, especially from an evolutionary perspective. And if that's right, then this means theism is the better theory to predict the suffering of our experience, not naturalism. So we've not only neutralized the evidential case, we've positively taken it away from naturalism and put it on the side of theism. That, of course, will require much more elaboration, which we'll just have to save for next time. But I don't know, maybe that'll get people interested as a teaser. Yeah, no, that sounds very interesting. And yeah, you're right. There's no way we could back that. So that's good. We'll have the leisure of like an entire segment. We could go through the philosophy of mind and so on. Hey, what's coming up next on Philosophy for the People, by the way? Yeah, what is coming up next? That's a good question. Well, we're doing a series on Wilfrid Sellars right now, which is pretty cool if anybody's interested in his thought. We often like to just do, a 3 or 4 part series on different thinkers. We've done sometimes a lot longer than that. We've done Plato, Aristotle, Marcuse. We're on Sellars now. We've done Kant, Leibniz. So that's what we're doing right now. I'm really just trying to finish the edits on my book. So once that's done, I'll probably do a series on some of the different content in there. Mm-hmm. Awesome. That sounds great. Well, Pat, hey, thank you so much for coming on the show. We appreciate it. Thank you, Gary. Always a joy. Yes, it's Pat Flynn,
check it out, folks. The Philosophy for the People on YouTube. Great content, especially for you philosophy lovers. You definitely need to check it out. All right. Wow. The hour's gone. Coming up next, High Impact Catholic Talk coming at you with the Terry Jesse Show. Thank you so much for listening. God willing, we'll be back again tomorrow. This thing is called Hands on Apologetics. Bye-bye, everyone.